What up guys, it's your boy K-Flow. Today I'm going to show you how to remove and reinstall the transmission on your Toyota Tacoma. Let's get this thing started. This video was brought to you by K-Flow's Crib, your #1 resource for Tacoma DIY projects. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell so you guys get notifications of my new videos that I do release regarding Tacoma DIY projects. The transmission that will be removed in this video is from a 2009 Toyota Tacoma, and the reason that I'm removing and reinstalling this transmission is I'm going to actually install a new clutch, flywheel, and rear main seal, and the details for installation of those parts will be covered in another video. This is a pretty complicated job, and I don't recommend this to any of the beginner wrench turners. And before you can remove the transmission, there are actually a few other removals that you do have to do, and those will be covered in higher details in videos in my channel, and those will also be linked in the description below. But to recap: disconnect the negative terminal, jack the front and the back of the truck so it's level, remove front drive shaft, remove rear catalytic converter, disconnect forward end of rear drive shaft and set that to the side, remove the mid console and the shifter assembly. Now let's get to removing the transmission. Under the hood, clamp down the hydraulic line to prevent hydraulic fluid from leaking out. On the transmission, use PB blaster on bolts on the clutch cover plate, and those are 12mm bolts to remove. For now, use PB blaster on the clutch release cylinder bolts and the accumulator, as well as the flare nuts. We wait a few minutes for those bolts to soak in the PB blaster. As we're waiting, we can remove the exhaust bracket mounted on the transmission, and those are 14mm bolts. We do this for both the driver and passenger sides. Here, we'll need to use a 5-point line wrench to remove the hard line between the release cylinder and the accumulator. It is secured by a 12mm bolt, so once we remove that bracket, that whole line should come off. We should be able to remove the clutch release cylinder, and that is secured by two 12mm bolts. We can also remove the accumulator with a 12mm socket, and there are 3 bolts holding down the accumulator and 1 bolt holding down the hydraulic line. And we can keep that connected to the hydraulic line as you see here. At this point, let's start removing as much of the wiring as possible. First, we'll work on removing the oxygen sensor harness on the driver's side. We can remove the harnesses at the rear. We can remove the harnesses at the transfer case. And just a note, there are 2 of the same harnesses, so I used a paint pen to mark one of them to distinguish the difference. We can remove the oxygen sensor harness on the passenger side. And we can also remove the transmission harness. Now, let's work on disconnecting the starter. First, let's remove the wire harness here, and remove the 12mm nut here, and the 12mm bolt here. Now let's disconnect the starter body. We use a 14mm socket to remove those bolts off of the transmission. And we can take that starter and just rest it against the frame. For now, we can loosen and only loosen the lower reachable bolts on the transmission, and those are going to be either 14mm or a 17mm bolt. Now we can jack up the transmission with a transmission jack, just enough to take the weight off of the mounts, and remove the transmission mount and the transmission bracket. And again, just to point out, the removal of the transmission mount and the transmission mount bracket will be in higher details in another video in this channel. Make sure the safety chain or strap is wrapped around the transmission and lower the transmission by a few inches, just enough to tilt it so we can reach the two upper 17mm bolts that mounts the transmission to the motor. Just a heads up, this part of the work will become a little bit of a pain in the ass. You will need a really long stack of extensions with a wobble socket all the way in the front that span the length of the transmission, as well as a good breaker bar. There will be some flex to the extensions, so be careful and be patient when removing those two upper 17mm bolts. Yes! And here is where those two upper bolts are relative to the transmission. Just to point out, one of the upper bolts will have a clip that attaches onto the vent for the transmission, so don't lose that clip. You can also reach the next two upper bolts and remove them using this same technique. And here's a quick tip for you guys. Be as organized as possible when you remove all the hardware. It will make your life easier when everything has to be reinstalled. Make sure you label each group of hardware as they come off. Now that we have more room above the transmission, we can remove the rest of the wiring harnesses mounted on the transmission and set them to the side. And here are some tips. They will be wrapped together with this plastic ring. So lift up one side and it should open. This plastic clip just requires the middle to be squeezed so you can remove it. This plastic clip, you need to use a small screwdriver and pry that open so that you can remove it. And here you'll see sections of the cable is actually taped onto the bracket against the transmission. And all I did was cut it with a knife so I can remove the cables. Now we can raise the transmission back up to level. Then we spray water into the clutch so that we don't get that clutch dust everywhere. Now we can remove the rest of the bolts holding the transmission against the motor. And those are 14mm and 17mm bolts. Next, we use a pry bar to carefully separate the transmission from the motor. Take your time and be patient with this part, because it might be a little bit seized and a little bit tight. And once it's fully separated, we can finally lower the transmission jack. Just to point out, I did not know where the center of gravity was for this transmission, and I was just a little bit too forward, and it made lowering the transmission more heavy towards the back. So I actually had to support the transmission at the back as that whole thing was lowered. So if you're going to tackle this, reposition the transmission jack to this part of the transmission connected to the mounts. So that's how you remove a transmission. It's not that bad, right?
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying?
Now with the transmission removed, you can do whatever you need to do now, whether it be replacing the transmission, rebuilding it, or installing a new flywheel, clutch, and rear main seal. Now let's get to the installation. As you can see here, I repositioned the transmission so that it's balanced onto the jack. We can roll the transmission underneath and line it up as much as possible. Jack up the transmission slowly and line it as you continue to go up. Take your time and do it carefully. Make sure you're not pinching any of the cables or hydraulic lines. Adjust the transmission's position carefully as needed with the transmission adjustment knob on the jack.
and eventually the transmission and motor will line up and close on each other. It may still have a gap, but the bolts will be long enough to help you completely pull the motor and the transmission together. I installed the first 17mm bolt on the passenger side here, and only keeping that hand tight. Then I installed the 14mm bolt here on the driver's side, and also keeping that hand tight. Now we can install all the lower bolts and keep them all hand tight as well, and those are a combination of 14mm and 17mm bolts. Now let's lower the transmission by a few inches. We should now be able to install the two 17mm upper bolts with the really long extension stack and torque them down to 53 foot-pounds.
Yes.
As a reminder, there will be a transmission vent clip on one of these bolts. Make sure that is installed. We can also install the transmission vent and install the next two upper bolts using the same technique, and those are also 17mm bolts torqued down to 53 foot-pounds. Now let's torque down the rest of the bolts. All lower 14mm bolts are torqued down to 28 foot-pounds, and the one lower 17mm bolt is torqued down to 53 foot-pounds. Here is a quick shot summarizing the bolt sizes and the torque specs. Now let's reinstall all the wiring harnesses. First, the ones on the transfer case and everything at the rear. We can reinstall all the oxygen sensor harnesses and transmission sensor harness. And remember, the ones that are taped, I used zip tie to reinstall them back onto those plastic tabs. Now, we do have to reposition the jack. I used a jack stand and a block to rest the transfer case against it, so I can remove the jack and move it towards the front of the transmission. We can now jack up the transmission and install the transmission bracket and mount. And again, that installation will be covered in much more details in another video. We can reinstall the starter. Make sure we reinstall all the wire harnesses and connections. And the two 14mm bolts are torqued down to 27 foot-pounds. We can now install the 3 bolts on the accumulator and the bolt holding the hydraulic line. Those are 12mm and torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. Here, we install the clutch release cylinder and the hydraulic line connected to the accumulator. And those are also 12mm bolts and torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. We make sure we hand tighten the flare nuts with that 5-point wrench. We can now reinstall the clutch cylinder cover. Those are also 12mm bolts torqued down to 8 foot-pounds.
And the rest is reassembly, but to highlight the work,
we'll need to reinstall the mid console and the shifter knob. We'll need to reconnect the rear drive shaft, reinstall the front drive shaft, reinstall the rear catalytic converter, reconnect the negative, remove the clamp on the hydraulic line, and jack down the truck.
and the last thing we have to do is bleed the clutch and adjust the clutch engagement point on the pedal. I swear, that's it. Thanks for watching this video, guys. This video is probably the most complicated video I've made up to date. So make sure you give me a like, and if you could share this video with your friends, make sure you do that for me as well. So keep in mind, when you do perform this work, the cost of tools as well as new parts will still be much cheaper than how much you would pay at the dealership. And I do recommend getting yourself a transmission jack. That will make your life very easy when removing and reinstalling that transmission. This job will take you several hours to do, but it will also save you several hundreds of dollars, if not thousands, instead of paying the dealership. So make sure you take your time when you do this. So that's pretty much it for today, guys. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Chris Fix. Thanks to all your videos, I was able to tackle this job strategically and concisely by myself. And I also wanted to give a quick shout out to my Patreon patron, Rich. Thank you for the continued support that you've given this channel throughout all these months. If you guys wanted to help out the content creation of this channel, please make sure you check out my Patreon page. Go to patreon.kflow-script.com. That's pretty much it, guys. Till next time, peace out.